Today's episode of the No-Till Market Garden Podcast is brought to you by BCS America.
BCS two-wheel tractors power dozens of professional quality, PTO-driven attachments for soil working, mowing, property maintenance, snow removal, and more. BCS tractors are famous for their durability and versatility, with handlebars that rotate 180 degrees for front and rear mount implements. And now, BCS has introduced a game changer in the two-wheel tractor world. Model 770 with hydrostatic drive. Model 770's Easy Grip lever enables the operator to precisely select ground speed and direction of travel without the need to shift or vary the throttle. This is extremely useful for heavy mowing or snow clearing jobs where constant changes in direction or speed are necessary. Now you can keep the flail mower running at full RPM while you mow forward, reverse, and forward again, all without the need to shift or re-engage the PTO. The hydrostatic Model 770 is on sale now. Check out bcsamerica.com for sale pricing and to find your nearest dealer. That's bcsamerica.com.
Today's show is also brought to you by Growers & Co. One of the most exciting developments in recent years is that, thanks to Jean-Martin Fortier, the market gardener, and his team, there is now a clothing, tool, and apparel company that was built for exactly the type of work we talk about on this show. I know that I've personally grown tired of looking through workwear websites and catalogs built for fishing or carpentry to find what I need for market gardening, so I was thrilled when Growers & Co. came to fruition, and even more thrilled when I tried their clothing. They have done absolutely excellent work. Their clothing is well made and well fitted. The tools are well designed by growers and made to last. There is also a magazine that Growers & Co. is putting out twice per year with a focus on small scale farming. I love the clothes. I rock the Muscovich vest a lot. The shirts, the hats, all of it. Anyway, follow Growers & Co. on Instagram and all the platforms and check out what they have to offer at growers.co. All right. Let's jam. Hey, you all, Farmer Jesse here. Welcome to the No-Till Market Garden Podcast, episode 23, season 3. Today on the podcast, I caught up with Steve Larson of Living City Farms in Akron, Ohio, to chat about this super cool small-scale no-till operation he helps run up there. We got into some of the different soil and plant health approaches that Steve has taken, including working with some products from Advancing Eco Agriculture and also with Elaine Ingham. We talk about cover crops and the plant responses he saw. We talk about a compost disaster that was actually not contamination and a whole lot else. I met Steve a few years ago at the Acres Conference in Louisville and have enjoyed watching his work ever since. Before we get going, if you have not pre-ordered a copy of my forthcoming book, The Living Soil Handbook, but you'd like to support our work, you can literally do both at the same time over at no-tillgrowers.com, where when you purchase the book from us, the proceeds go to making more content for you, like the podcasts that we do, like more videos and articles and all of that. Anyway, the book ships in July. I worked ridiculously hard on it for a year and a half, so I hope you like it. Again, pre-order now at no-tillgrowers.com. All right, enough for me. Let's get into this amazing conversation with Steve Larson of Living City Farms. Steve Larson, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me. It's an honor to be here.
And it's an honor to have you. I feel like we met a couple of years ago at the Acres Conference, and I've been really fascinated by what you have going on. So I'm excited to bring you on. So let's start where we always start. Give us the rundown of Living City Farms. Where are you located, the kind of acreage you're working on, and those sorts of things?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so we are Living City Farms, and we are located in Akron, Ohio. And we're currently expanding to a new location in Talmadge, Ohio, which is a suburb of Akron. But for the past few years, we have been growing in a neighborhood called Summit Lake in South Akron. And we're on a pretty small scale. We have 3 lots or areas in the neighborhood that we've been primarily growing on, 2 of which we've been focusing our intensive production on. And so it's probably a little bit less than half of an acre. We use a permanent bed system, so we've got 30-inch wide beds that are all about 40 feet long, and in total I'd say we have roughly 90 of those on the 2 gardens. And then at the new farm in Talmadge, it's going to be a lot more space. We just recently had about an acre and a half of the land cleared. It used to be old horse pasture, so it was about 8 years of ecological succession that had started to grow, and had that cleared for us and then planted into cover crops so that we can try to have that in production this spring.
Nice. And then where is the produce going? What's the marketing strategy?
Yeah, so primarily most of what we grow goes directly to a restaurant that is called Miss Julie's Kitchen. It's a vegan farm-to-table restaurant, and it's actually the restaurant that started the farm that's now Living City Farms. So I'd say about 8 years ago, Julie Costell, who's a good friend of mine and the founder of Miss Julie's Kitchen, she had started to get into urban farming. She'd gardened for a really long time, and she had this vegan farm-to-table restaurant that she had created and was having trouble accessing certain things and certain quantities that she wanted, and she really loved growing food and helping people. And so she had not really acquired, but she had begun renting some lots and began growing food on them. First year went pretty well, and then ended up having to move off that space into the space that we're currently on right now. And so those gardens have been there since 2013 with Miss Julie's Kitchen. And so the majority of the produce goes directly there. And then we also sell some of it at a neighborhood farmers market that's a few blocks from where the farm's at. And then this summer, we also tried to open up a new sales outlet, doing a weekly sales online order for a business called SD Myers that we're connected with. And we would put out an order form on a Google form, send it out Wednesday, and then by Friday, we would be harvesting and delivering the orders directly to the business.
Nice. And then when you say we, how many people are working there?
Yeah, so I say we, and currently we are 2 farmers, myself and my coworker, M. Evans. And in the past, we worked with a summer youth employment program where we've had anywhere from 1 to 4 youth workers that help with us. But also when I say we, we're a part of a larger organization called Good Place Holdings. And so I'm just the farm manager. I'm not the farm owner. And we're connected with Miss Julie's Kitchen. That is now also a Good Place organization. And so Good Place is, they're a holdings company that really wants to support mission-driven businesses that are economically regenerative, value people over profit, and build up good places in their community. And so the founder of Good Place Holdings has been a business advisor to Julie for a really long time. And it's been a long time in the making for Miss Julie's Kitchen to become a Good Place organization to kind of try to take her mission to the next level. And so about 4 years ago, I started talking with them, and Julie was going through some surgeries. And so she wasn't going to be able to be doing any of the farming. And so they hired a friend of mine to come in and run the gardens and try to figure out how we can take it from being a space that grows food for the restaurant and provides some seasonal work into how we can figure out how to make it a economically regenerative business on its own so that it can start to employ more people and help the farm develop its own mission, but also help with the mission of Good Place Holdings.
Okay, that's great. So talk a little bit about how you kind of got into, gardening and agriculture. Like, what was your sort of origin story there?
Yeah, so kind of goes back when I was a little kid, and there's a woman that I called my grandma that lived down the road from me, who she actually wasn't related, but she would watch my sister and I when we were growing up. And she had a big garden. I just have very vague memories of eating cherry tomatoes right out of the garden. And so for a while, I had really wanted to get into gardening, but it wasn't until high school that my mom and I started a garden in our backyard. And so I kind of got into it then. And in college, I went to school for Spanish and Arabic. And about halfway through my academic career, I realized that when I was in school, I enjoyed what I was studying, but I wanted to be outside in the forest, foraging, growing food. And so I started to feel that there's this large disconnect between my projection through the academic world and what I actually really wanted to do. And so I had woofed a little bit during my college career and also had gotten a job at a farm down the road from my university, which kind of got me more introduced to agriculture outside of just backyard gardening, and had then, after graduating, traveled for a couple of years on a bicycle in the United States and Mexico and Central America. And when I was traveling, I was able to visit some farms, but I landed in Costa Rica for a few months and was able to live off the grid and just really kind of live a simple lifestyle, and was able to grow food and kind of experience what it'd be to live more off the land and less of this is what I want as a career path, but just kind of starting to understand a little bit more of the context that I wanted to see my life within and live within. And so when I came back to the United States, I needed some work and spoke with Julie at Miss Julie's Kitchen, and she was able to have me come and help run the gardens for a couple of years. Then I was able to find an apprenticeship at another farm locally. And around when that was ending, I was kind of questioning whether I wanted to keep farming, because I feel like a lot of the places that I've worked, we spent a lot of time weeding and just doing things that are very unpleasant. And within farming, you're always going to have to do things that are unpleasant. But I just feel like those experiences, and especially working with inner city kids and introducing them to gardening and agriculture, and then having them have to sit on a bucket for hours on end pulling the weeds from the bean patch, there just were a lot of things I was like, man, my life feels more valuable than this. And so I feel like it really wasn't until I started to learn more about these no-till systems that I started to see that there was a different way of doing it, and that a lot of these issues that I was encountering with the things that I wasn't enjoying with farming had to do with human management, not so much were inherent to farming itself. And so through learning about these different management techniques, it kind of helped rekindle that wanting to keep farming.
Right. That's kind of something I hadn't really thought about, this angle of like when you're bringing on woofers, and these are people that are at least obsessively kind of at least vaguely interested in farming. Mm-hmm. And then you bring them on, in a woof context or an internship or something, and then you basically just have them pull weeds. Like, that's not a great recipe for breeding farmers.
No, not at all. And not a good long-term plan to keep farmers in the industry.
Right.
For me, I guess farming is a very spiritual connection as well. And so that deepening of the relationship that I want to get through agriculture and through life, some of my past experiences on farms where it felt like we were just in utter warfare with nature. And even though it was a better kind of warfare than conventional agriculture, where we're using organic methods to deal with these things, it still felt like you'd wake up in the morning and you're going to battle. And that didn't really sit well with my heart and with how I wanted to spend my time.
Yeah, I very much relate to that in terms of like the tillage farms where I've worked, and also when we early on in our business, we were maybe more of a tillage farm. It feels very much like warfare. Like you're going and you're battling the weeds and you're just doing everything you can to kind of survive the season.
Right.
And it's not a very satisfying way to run a business.
No, not at all.
So talk about your roots with, ecological farming. Like what were some of the first things that you kind of came across and that kind of inspired you to think there were different options?
Yeah. So I had gone vegetarian when I was in high school, and I think that was my first introduction to starting to learn more about just organic food. But at that point, it was a very superficial idea of what organic was. And it was just, I saw this sticker that was on the produce and the bananas that we were buying from the store. And so it wasn't until, I think, college when I was able to woof on a couple different farms that had more quote unquote organic practices that were involved more with the lifestyle. But I think learning more about permaculture was a good introduction to me with something that was thinking even more outside the box. But the struggle that I had with my introduction with all of that was that it was from a very kind of backyard gardening standpoint. And when I was in my first PDC, I remember taking it and I was like, man, this all sounds great, but in the spring, we got to hire the guy with the tractor to come till up the land because we don't like the methods that we're talking about right now. Even though I'm at a small scale, it's larger than what we're talking about. And I have absolutely no idea how to translate that. And so I think farms like Singing Frogs and Richard Perkins with Ridgedale Permaculture, once I had the opportunity to actually be at this farm and be able to start having more management opportunities to dictate what are the practices we're going to have and not have, it allowed me to kind of just like dive into trying to figure that out with a couple of the different methodologies that I was hearing about along the way as we were trying to figure that out as well, which I'm super glad that this network has started because there's just so much information that's available online now with all this, where even just 4 or 5 years back, there was not that much. And so I'd say those are kind of my introductions. And since then, I've been getting a lot more interested in not just the European origins of agriculture, but also wanting to acknowledge the land that we're on in Northeast Ohio and the ancestral practices that were here, where agriculture has been here for a really long time. And for a lot of that prior to the Europeans coming over was done within polyculture systems. And so I'm super fascinated with the whole milpa growing system in Mexico and Central America, where they have their cornfield, and it's similar to the Three Sisters, where you have the beans growing up the corn stalks and the squash on the growing along the ground. But the more I learn about those systems, they also will plant chilies and tomatoes and other vegetables within that growing area. And then there's this fascinating concept of quelites, which is roughly translated just as what we would see as a weed or a green growing plant that could be eaten fresh. And so we have a few weeds that grow, quote unquote, weeds that grow in our region that are considered to be quelites down in Mexico, like purslane, goosefoot, and wild amaranth. And down in Mexico, they have like, you prepare the land and you grow all these cultivated foods, but then you also have this gift of the soil being covered with these quelites that are also a really integral part of the indigenous diet down there. And I just have I get a joy when we have a Mexican neighbor to the farm, and she'll sometimes come down and she'll come and visit. And the deep mulch system has really helped us with weed control, but every once in a while the weeds still grow, and we get a lot of amaranth growing, a lot of purslane, and she'll come down and she'll just get so excited to come in, and she'll come in, she'll harvest them to take home. And so she'll help us weed, and then she has food that she's able to feed her family that reminds her of being back down in Mexico.
Yeah, that's cool. I love, this is like something I don't know how to really like articulate yet, but the idea of rethinking weeds, I know it's certainly something that has been, a lot of people have addressed and talked about, there's no such thing as a weed and those sorts of things. But this idea of just like rethinking what they are in the garden. And, the other day I'm out with the kids and we're eating, chickweed, because it's wonderful and it's so crisp and delicious in the wintertime. And I'm like, this is a weed for, most farms, but I love this weed and I want it in my gardens, and I want to find some purslane and I want to find some lamb's quarters and stuff, without letting it get too out of hand.
Right.
Because they're one, they're good for you, but two, they're also good for the soil, and they're keeping photosynthetic activity going. So it's not necessary. Like I'm like trying to figure out where I stand on weeds.
Yeah. And I have made the, I would say maybe not mistake, but sometimes it feels like a mistake of getting too excited about things like that and then having them all go to seed. And so then
Right.
the years to come, you're like, wow, I probably should have just pulled those out or clipped those out before they went to seed, so I don't have this nightmare of a weed mess, or quote unquote weed mess.
Right. It's like finding that balance of seeing one and being like, that's not an issue. Or, like they're like quackgrass, for instance. I don't I don't see a lot of value in having that in my garden. But
Right.
so those have to go. But, if I have a little bit outbreak of purslane, it's not the end of the world. And it's tasty. And I've found that my wife really loves it. So, yeah, I don't know, rethinking and reevaluating my relationship with weeds every year. When you said that you kind of employed some of that deep compost mulch system and maybe some other things. Do you want to talk about like how, what your strategy was for that in the beginning, and like maybe even lead that into like what worked and what didn't?
Yeah, for sure. So when I first started at the farm, I was actually hired in April, and so the growing season had already started, and it was just kind of like we had to jump right into it. And it was this exciting first opportunity to be able to do something without tillage, so I really wanted to do my best to not have to bring a rototiller in order to wait another year to start trying to experiment with more no-till practices. So what that ended up with us doing was getting a couple silage tarps to use on the space. Ended up not being able to cover the whole entire space, so we still ended up being out there with the hula hose and pulling by hands, which, thinking back on it, probably in those places it would have been it'd been easier to use a rototiller, and if we just did it shallowly, probably the same amount of damage that we were doing or disturbance that was happening. So I feel like there's been a lot of lessons of really wanting to try to do it no-till, and sometimes probably being a little bit more rigid than necessary, where now I see tillage more so as a management technique or a tool to use at certain times, but don't want it to be something that's a perpetual management technique. So that's how we kind of initiated the space, and there are already raised beds that were more or less there, and so we widened them a little bit by digging out the pathways so that they were 30 inches wide, and purchased in a couple different types of compost to just put an inch or two down. And the first season was, I'd say the success, it was relatively successful. I was pretty happy with plant growth, but the year that followed, and even since then, I had gone through Elaine Ingham's online trainings a few years back, her old courses, and so I started to learn how to use a microscope. And so over the winter time, when I was getting samples from the different compost companies that we have access to, which aren't, we don't have access to a whole lot of different types of compost here. But in the winter time, I got samples and I looked at them underneath the microscope, and from my little bit of training at that point, I wasn't seeing much. And so I based an assumption that these composts aren't very living. And so I ended up going with a leaf compost for the past couple of years, partly because of that and not wanting to overload on a lot of animal manure, and kind of trying to go with that methodology of using compost and compost extract and teas and not really any fertilizers. I tried that for a couple of seasons, and the plant health just wasn't to where I was hoping and expecting it to be. And I don't think it was a failure of the technique itself. It's just that there's so many different contexts that are out there. And I had made a mistake to try to put all my eggs in that one basket instead of trying to have a wider toolkit where if my plants weren't looking that well, then maybe instead of trying to keep applying a compost tea or extract and not having results with it, I would come in and actually bring it with either a foliar nutrients or fertilizing the soil and the plants that way, just in order to kind of have a healthier crop. And so I've since been really into John Kemp's work with advancing eco-agriculture. There's a guy from Colombia named Jairo Restrepo Riveras, and he teaches a system that's kind of like Korean natural farming, but kind of based out of the Latin American context, where he does a lot of anaerobic ferments, but talks about using chelated nutrients in order to feed plants initially to get the plant health up and have that continuum of the ecosystem processes of having a healthy plant start to lead to healthy soil, instead of just focusing on the only point of entry being, well, I have to have healthy soil in order to have healthy plants. And if my soil is not healthy, then I can't have healthy plants. And I just felt like I was kind of hitting my head against the wall with that. And then kind of along the same topic of compost, this past spring, we made, I feel like, one of the larger mistakes with our compost, where we transitioned to a new source that I found of leaf mold, and went to take a look at it in the fall. And it wasn't that decomposed, but I was like, well, if it sits for, I don't know, another 5 months, they'll probably break down more and this will be good to go. And so we purchased in a lot of it last spring. And while we were putting it on, I actually threw my back out for 2 weeks.
Oh, wow.
Which was like an interesting start to the beginning of the pandemic. I threw my back out, and then we put all this leaf mold on top of our beds, a little bit thicker than we normally do. So we probably had like 2 or 3 inches, and nothing grew. So everything was stunted that we grew in that one garden.
What do you chalk that up to? You think it just was still decomposing, so it was locking up the nitrogen, or like what do you think was happening in that?
I do think it was that it was just not decomposed enough, and we put so much on it that we were using it as a growing medium. And so I think it was that with the cold spring, and so just like the soil is slowly starting to wake up, so not all the nutrients are available that would be at the when it's hot in the summertime. And so having this undecomposed compost that isn't able to support lives, but putting it in a context where it's supposed to support the beginning phases of our plant lives. And then we got hit with a couple frosts later in the season that kind of, I think, help add to the downward spiral. And later in the spring, I started to do some plant assays in our nursery, where I took that straight compost, the other compost that we had used the first year, which was a mixture of different manures and some other ingredients, and I planted plants straight into that, and lo and behold, the stuff that we use did not grow anything. They're super stunted, looked absolutely horrible, and then the other compost actually had really good looking healthy plants. And so now, moving into the future, I'm going to be very adamant that if we change our compost source, to make sure that if I'm going to do a microscope assessment, do it when it's warm, where the microbes are active, and also to do plant assays with it to make sure, if we're trying to have it thick as a mulch and use it as a growing medium, to be 100% certain that it actually can support plant life.
I think that's super important. We talked about this a little bit with Jane Murner-Cynical of Earth Care Farm, but the idea of doing assays like that, of essentially just maybe even doing, like a one tray of peas with all the different compost that you have sampled around from local areas, and then letting those go out and then just evaluating how well they do. And that eliminates issues of, compost that's not fully decomposed, also possibly some sort of contaminants, any sort of persistent herbicides.
Right.
Yeah, I think that's something that maybe needs a little bit more focus.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I'm really good friends with a guy named Nathan Rutz with Till Soil, who's one of the sponsors of this up in Cleveland. And he's always doing plant assays for all of his potting soil. And I'm always talking with him about these things. And so I just constantly just kicking myself in the butt for not doing that ahead of time. But I know that it's one of those situations where you make a mistake like that and you're not going to make it again.
Right. No, that's a good point. So with the Kemp stuff and the other gentleman that you mentioned down in Central America, have you got to apply more of those things yet? Have you been able to see the effects of that?
Yeah. So this past season, we started to do more with foliar applications of nutrients. And I had the intention, so a couple falls ago, the man that I mentioned, Jairo Restrepo Rivera, is from Colombia. He came to Atlanta to do a 3-day workshop. And I was actually introduced to his work in Mexico a few years ago and was kind of freaked out because they have this stuff called biol, which is a biofertilizer that they ferment in 55-gallon drums with a base of cow dung. And they add a bunch of ingredients to it. They close it off for a month or two, and it ferments away. And when I smelled it, it just like smelled like rancid feces. And with my training with Elaine Ingham, with this idea that the aerobic organisms are the ones that you're trying to cultivate, and the anaerobic organisms are the quote unquote undesirables in the soil, I was just kind of freaked out by the system. But as I learn more about soil and just ecosystem health, it leads me to try to put less black and white boundaries, binaries on things, and also that my understanding is super limited. Human understanding is also limited. So trying to take more of a stance of humility with those things. So I tried to make some of that biofertilizer over the winter, and it didn't go very well. And so my plan of using that for last season didn't go through. So we ended up purchasing some of the inputs from Advancing Eco Agriculture, partly because I listened to all of John Kemp's webinars. I've taken some of his online trainings. He's actually from Middlefield, Ohio, which is about an hour from us. So I can literally just go drive up to their headquarters to pick up product. And they've been super helpful when I call them up on the phone. And so I had talked to them about some of the issues that we had in the spring with just plants not growing, and got some recommendations from them to use a few of their different products. One that's called Rejuvenate, which is a mixture of humic acid and molasses. Plus, I think there's some micronutrients in it. And they have another one called Sea Shield, which is more or less like a raw fish hydrolysate. And they had recommended to kind of use those in order to get some initial food sources down into that compost in the soil, so that there's a readily available food source that the organisms themselves and the plants can start to use. And then they had another product that there might have been like 5 or 6 micronutrients, chelated micronutrients in it. There's some seaweed and a few other things that was mixed in it that we began to foliar with. And not everything responded, but we did have some good responses from certain vegetables. Our first plantings of kale and collards, which we grow a lot of, they were toast. We had to plant. We tried them a few different times, and then just had to plant them in a completely separate location in May. But we had. I'm trying to think with some of the other crops that responded well. Like our parsley, our peas, we had our onions finally were able to respond, and some other vegetables too that foliar feeding. But one thing that, and I guess in our other garden that I can talk about where we had in cover crop, and so we did not put that compost down on. So that luckily gave us some space where we knew that we weren't going to use that compost, and we had planted a mixed species cover crop the fall prior, kind of with the intention of having the space fully in cover crop as we slowly transition to the new farm. But COVID hit, and we were like, no, we want to bring this all into production. So it gave us the opportunity to have a first experiment with growing the cover crop and knocking it down and having the mulch grown in place and be able to plant into that. I've been really inspired by what Frith Farm has been doing with that system and some other farms with their experiments. And so we're actually able to have a little over half of one of our garden spaces into that to plant our okra, kale, collards, and tomatoes into. And the plant health that we had in that section was probably some of the healthiest plants that I think we've ever had. since I've been growing in this space. And like our tomato production has actually been going downhill over the past few years, partly I think because of my stubbornness and just wanting to use biology, not bring in any sort of fertilizer or even mineral input. But where these tomatoes were placed this year, we did not add any extra nitrogen or minerals to the soil itself, but just had the cover crop grown in place. And then we foliar fed a few times during the season. And then later in the season, I wanted to keep foliar feeding, but the plants were just too overgrown. And I have a little 15-gallon sprayer that I jerry-rigged together to pull around the gardens that just couldn't fit down the pathways anymore. But I did a couple experiments with our okra where I sprayed some with the foliar and didn't spray the other ones. And the plants themselves were slightly bigger with the foliar applications, but production-wise, I don't think I noticed a big difference. And so it's hard to tell exactly what results came specifically from the foliar applications versus kind of what just holistically was happening on the farm that was leading to that health. Where in the future, one of the things that I'm going to try to do a better job is to set up specific areas that either are going to be foliar fed or they're not going to be foliar fed, just so that we can have a better system of understanding if what we're doing is actually effective or not.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I also don't think enough credit gets given to the sort of structure of the soil as well. We talk a lot about tillage versus no tillage, or foliar applications and that sort of stuff, but we don't really get into compaction and water movement and all of the sort of things that ultimately add up to poor plant health. You mentioned aerobic versus anaerobic microbes, and one of the issues with anaerobic microbes isn't that they exist. They're great. You need lots of anaerobes, but when they kind of build up in a very anaerobic situation, they produce gases and those sorts of things that are ultimately toxic to plants. Mm-hmm. So that structure becomes critically important. And I think that's one of the reasons that cover crops work so well, is they're so good at building soil structure.
Right. Yeah. And that's one thing that I didn't mention with us being inside the city on these urban lots. It's not pristine ag land, or even if ag land could be pristine, but they're lots in the city that at one time had buildings on them, and we've had them tested for heavy metals, and we're not worried about toxicities of heavy metals. But when the city or a business or person tears down a building or a house, they don't always do the best job, and a lot of times they leave the foundation in the ground. And so over the years, we've just dug up a ridiculous amount of bricks and cinder blocks and slabs of concrete. And so we've tried to remove as much of that as we can, but there's still a lot of really weird compaction zones that I feel like don't follow the same pattern that they would in a conventional ag field, where you have your quote unquote traditional plow pan at a depth that you can more or less have a logical understanding of. Whereas where we're at, we've got strange things that have been in the ground that we don't quite know where they're at, or why certain issues are arising because of what used to be there. And so about 12 inches deep, we have a pretty serious compaction issue. And in the garden where we had the cover crop, that has the worst compaction issues, where a part of the garden, if we get a couple of heavy rains, then the soil waterlogs. And then we just start having a lot of disease pressure that we had beautiful looking eggplants through half the season. And then we got some heavy rains and the soil waterlogged, and we just had disease come through. Partly, I think, because the soil gets saturated and creates an environment that's conducive for these fungal pathogens that grow in damp soil like that. So even though we're working on building good soil structure in the top 12 inches, we've been struggling to go deeper than that because of the urban problems that we have. And so it's taking time to progress with that. But I do think with the cover crop, that's if I can kind of look back on everything that we've done up to this point, I feel like that's where I've been able to see the most progress happen in the shortest amount of time, is integrating that into our growing system. So I'm super excited to try to do more with that going on into the future, because of that. And also I just want to be able to find ways to grow food with less and less inputs. And so having to import a crazy amount of compost every season, although like I think it's a good use of that organic matter that's waste in a lot of ways that we're able to recycle, being close to an urban center and suburban center, I still want to find ways to minimize the need to import whatever we can.
Yeah, that's great. Hey, you all, just jumping in real quick to get a word from our sponsors like Tilth Soil. Tilth Soil makes NOP-compliant living potting soils in Cleveland, Ohio, with food scraps they haul and compost themselves. Each batch of soil is tested against the competitors, and the results are in. Plants vote for Tilth Soil. To learn more about their full line of products, please visit www.tilthsoil.com. This show is also brought to you by you, the patrons. Our patrons at patreon.com/no-till-growers are the absolute best. I appreciate each and every one of you so much. If you love this show or the No-Till Flowers podcast or the videos or Growers Live or anything else that we do, and you want to support it, go to patreon.com/no-till-growers and consider signing up. And at a certain level, or if you just bump up from one level to another, you get a shout out on the show. So big shout outs this week to Ojai Roots, Scott Snodgrass, Jody Miller, Shane and Emma of Aslan Organics, Travis and Heidi of Arcadia Acres, Jacob Arthur, Fiona and Donnie of Firefly Farm, Jean-Martin Fortier, and Yannick LaPlante. Whether it's through Venmoing us a few bucks to @NoTillGrowers or pre-ordering my book or becoming a Patreon member, we appreciate all of our show supporters. All right, back to Steve. Yeah, I think it may have been in one of Diego Footer's newest podcasts, the In Search of Soil ones, that they talk about some layers of compaction can be extremely stubborn, like last for 5 or 10 years under really good soil management. Like biological decompaction is, I think, a little bit harder than maybe is given credit, but especially deep biological compaction, like you're talking 12 inches down, annual roots definitely get down there, but it's, the amount of time they need to be down there and really get to work with the proper biology to truly decompact something, especially when you have, water buildup that kind of slows that whole process down. That stuff that's very challenging. But I agree with you on the cover crops. I've seen few crop responses that equal, like with any sort of fertilizer, that equal that of just following a cover crop properly. There are times when we haven't fully terminated a cover crop, and that has been really detrimental. But on the reverse, when you have a good cover crop that is well terminated, it's just amazing, the crop response. We had amazing tomatoes this year following some really nice cover crop.
That's great. Yeah, and I will make a note that kind of how I mentioned earlier, that we're still working on getting some areas with the weeds under control, especially in the plot where the cover crop was. And so an issue that we did have, we knocked down the cover crop with a pallet just to get it on the ground, and we tarped it for a week, and it terminated the cover crop. But I'd say within a couple of weeks, we started to have a lot of growth of annual weeds. And with the cover crop in place, that mulch, it makes it even harder to go through with a hoe to weed. And so that did give us a little bit of a headache, which I feel like it was a welcomed headache with how healthy things were. But going into the future, I want to make a bigger effort to make sure to control the weed seed population. So starting out with like a deep compost mulch system to deal with the weeds, and then be able to go to cover crop from there. Because even though rye is supposed to have allelopathic properties and stop seeds from germinating, it didn't. And maybe our urban weeds, like our urban groundhogs, are extra resilient. I don't know, but they gave us a little bit of a trouble.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean on the flip side of that too, I like that approach, and I think that's actually what we're doing on the new farm a little bit is laying down some beds and getting some quick cover crops in, on top of deep compost mulches,
Mm.
in places, and then in other places we're doing different things. But the sort of other side of that is adding a mulch over top of the crop once it's terminated, as a sort of lasagna style. You're doing like compost over top of it, or you're doing even like a light colored mulch if it's in the middle of the summer and you're doing hot crops, that maybe don't necessarily need the boiling hot soil. That's another option to help sort of, especially in those first few years, to keep those weeds down from poking up through. No, I think it's a good point. I'm glad you pointed that out because we've had that issue in the past too.
Yeah, and I really like that point that you just made with even having the cover crop grow, knocking it down, and putting the compost on top of that. Because it's the thing that I appreciate the most is to have flexibility and to try to have a plan for what we're doing, but to be able to respond to the actual situation as it arises. Where I feel like it's really easy to get this idea in your head, like this is how it's going to go, and then when it doesn't go that way, then you're just at a loss for what to do.
Yeah, and I mean, it's nice with the cover crop situation. Like, let's say you do have a nice cover crop, you have a nice kill on it, and you're seeing some annual weeds come in like right after you put in a crop. To look around and be like, okay, well, and this is maybe what I should have done in my times when it failed, when the cover crop didn't fully terminate, is look around and see what mulches you can throw over top of that to sort of retain that benefit of the cover crop and not have to go through and like till it or, heavy cultivation or anything.
Right.
And you have a crop in situ. So just go ahead and you, like you said, like have that flexibility of just maybe throwing a mulch over top of it or, whatever it takes to sort of block those weeds out, to keep it more productive and not to reduce that competition.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I wanted to talk a little bit about your new property. Like before we got going, you were telling me that you were going to try some different things and you sort of mentioned it, but can you talk like specifics about kind of the plan with more polyculture stuff?
Yeah, for sure. So I'm actually really excited about this. I mentioned that 4 years ago, I started working with this organization, Good Place Holdings, and the initial conversations that I was having with the founder of Good Place Holdings was about kind of the struggles of being a farm worker that doesn't own land, doesn't own a farm, having seasonal jobs, having to find work in the winter time, and also that there's all these different growing systems out there, but there isn't a lot of these, I feel like, innovative systems that have been happening in Northeast Ohio. And he had just taken a permaculture course and was really into figuring out how to solve a lot of those issues in our context, and that a lot of like the patterns spoken about within permaculture resonated with the patterns that he had been seeing as trying to run organizations. And so I think 4 years later, we're able to, I think, finally start to realize some of those dreams. Where I read a book called Miraculous Abundance that was written some years back by farmers in France. And I don't speak French, so I'll butcher their name trying to say it, but the farm is La Ferme des Bec-Hagnon. And they wrote a book about the farm that they had created, being inspired by permaculture, but creating an economically viable farm that integrated a lot of those systems. And I was really taken aback when I was flipping through their book and looking at pictures and just seeing fruit trees growing with their annual vegetables. And just that experience of being in the middle of the summer when it's 90 degrees outside, full sun, and a baking field of vegetables. I was like, I love being in the woods. I love being around trees. It feels good. It feels sacred to be around beings that last longer than a season. And so since then, I've really been wanting to find ways to integrate that more into our growing systems. But I just hadn't really encountered that many resources and farmers who were doing it on a commercial scale. And I've since been able to find a lot more, understood that integrating trees and agriculture is called agroforestry, and the growing of crops between tree rows is called alley cropping. And so at the new farm, we plan to be alley cropping our no-till vegetables between rows of what we hope to be pawpaws, elderberries, and apples, and hope to also kind of integrate kind of a hedgerow systems in there to have a little bit of diversity. But we're still trying to figure out exactly how we want those plantings to be. But we're feeling good about bringing in the pawpaws, elderberries, and apples. Partly because the pawpaws and elderberries are native to the area, and there aren't a whole lot of people that are growing them. But our connection with Miss Julie's Kitchen can use a lot of those, and so she can make jams out of elderberries. She makes ice cream and donuts using those. And the pawpaws, this past year, she started to experiment with making pawpaw lemonade, pawpaw ice cream, and there might have been one or two other things. And then apples, she's able to cook with a lot of apples. So we're able to have, if we want to just supply that to her, we can, or with our intention of growing our market as well so that we can be more economically sustainable, we can have those as offerings for our community, but doing it in a way that isn't just having the pawpaw patch and the vegetable patch, but integrating them all into a whole system. And so we're really hoping to bring more of that whole systems design that been really intrigued about and been learning about for a long time. But in the city, we've been kind of focused more so just on making do with the situation that we have of not owning any of the land and supplying the vegetables for the restaurant. So we have this awesome opportunity to access. The property is about 8 acres, and we had about 1.5 acres cleared. So we're going to be putting up a deer fence. The fence in might be a little bit over 2 acres, but the production space where that's going to be is 1.5 to 2 acres. So we'll be able to have our mixed species growing in that space. So yeah, I'm super excited about it, and have just been recently learning about other farmers in the United States. There's a lot of this is happening in France. They call it orchard gardening. So I've been able to find a lot of resources in French, which I don't speak French, so I've spent a lot of time with Google Translate, just translating phrases and to try to understand their systems a little bit more. But there's more and more information that's coming out about farmers in the U.S. that are trying to do more of this, bring more of this agroforestry onto their farms. And there was this really good article that was just published in Growing for Market magazine in the month of February that spoke about this, referenced a handful of farms that are actively doing this.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly something that's come up a lot more on the podcast is sort of hedgerows. And I know, Jared's Real Food is one that comes to mind. Mm-hmm. He has a bunch of great, polyculture systems going. And then Cliff Davis down in Tennessee, I know he's got he's got a nice established sort of orchard come up and coming in his gardens, and it's definitely something that we're planning on doing on our new farm as well. Partially we, one of the farms where I worked in, where the farm where I interned, Bug Tussle Farm, this great farm, we didn't do a lot of polyculture stuff, but there was a big poplar tree right by one of the gardens. And it was such an important part of the farm, like in the middle of the summer when it's brutally hot and you're out cultivating, to be able to stop, grab a watermelon and sit under the poplar tree. Mm-hmm. And on our last farm, we didn't really have anything like that. We were very exposed. And I just remember thinking this is part of the reason. You've got to have a place where you can go and relax and sit under the hedgerow. And I know Singing Frogs has talked about that too. Just have a place that you can go chill in the shade. There's a huge value to that, or even just setting your vegetables in the shade, just a practical value.
Totally. Yeah.
Well, Steve Larson, this has been a wonderful conversation. I appreciate so much your time. Thank you for coming and chatting with me.
Yeah. Thanks so much for having me. It was fun chatting with you.
All right, if you enjoyed that episode, make sure to follow Steve and Living City Farms on Instagram and all the places. We will hook it up with links in the show notes. Also, don't forget to check out any of our new projects like the Winter Growers Podcast, Growers Live, No Till Flowers, all the things. Got a lot more stuff in the works as well. You can always see what we're up to at no-tillgrowers.com. My book, The Living Soil Handbook, is also on pre-order there now, and by buying it at no-tillgrowers.com, you throw a little more money into our creative budget so we can do more. Subscribe to this podcast wherever you are getting it and leave a review, but this week all reviews must not raise more questions than answers. Big thanks as always to Jackson Roulette and Josh Satin for their help. Huge thanks as always to Willie Breeding, who told me he is a patron of last week's guest, Harpeth Moon. Fun fact, he's the one that did the theme music. Enormous thank you, as always, to my fellow farmer and partner in life, Hannah Crabtree, for all she does behind the scenes. Thank you all for listening. We'll see you next week. Bye.
Yeah, we'll keep doing it, at least for the time being. And we've found a balance, so we're not all burned out doing it anymore.
Yeah, that's great.
Last year, we were a little bit on the cusp, I have to be honest with you.
I bet. Yeah,